You stand frozen in a chamber that holds no sound. A steel blade rests in your palm. Across your arm, a young man named Xian breathes slow in sleep. You are Emperor Ai. The largest empire on earth answers to your name. Your generals wait beyond these walls. Your ministers pace outside the door. And yet, you refuse to move him. You lift the knife. You slice through the silk of your own robe. You walk out with half a sleeve missing. 2,000 years of scholars wrote this down as the most tender gesture in Chinese history. They called it the passion of the cut sleeve. They called it love. Every word of it was a performance. Because what happened behind those palace walls was never a romance. It was an industry. For 20 centuries, the imperial courts of China ran a silent operation that processed young men like prized animals. Recruiters traveled into villages where mothers were selling rice bowls to eat. They pointed at boys. They counted coins. They walked away with human cargo. The names those boys were born with were burned from the records. Their personalities were dismantled piece by piece until nothing remained except the version the court wanted to own. The day a boy's jawline sharpened, the day his voice deepened, the day the softness left his face, the empire discarded him without a burial rite. These favorites lived wrapped in gold. They ate from plates most nobles would never touch. They commanded regiments at sunrise, and when the sun dropped, they slept with one eye open because they knew exactly what they were worth and exactly how fast that worth could vanish. The grooming process itself killed almost half of them before they ever reached the emperor's chamber. 4 out of every 10 boys did not survive the training. History remembers the emperors. It remembers the dynasties, the wars, the borders, the poetry. It does not remember the boys who were bought to decorate those lives. Their graves were never marked. Their faces were never painted. Their stories were scraped off the scrolls on purpose. What you are about to hear is the version nobody was allowed to write down. The real economics of the most expensive human beings in imperial history. A system built on one cold rule. Your face purchased your throne, and your age purchased your grave. Before we walk into this machine, I want you to drop a comment telling me the exact city and country where you are watching from right now. Hit that subscribe button and help this project grow. You are watching Ancestral, the best dark history channel in the world. The dirt roads cutting through the Han Empire in 15 BC carried no poetry. They carried the sound of hunger. When winter dropped its weight across the northern provinces, the mud hardened into ridges sharp enough to split a sandal. And right behind the first hard freeze came the men nobody wanted to see. The tax collectors. For a farmer working a stretch of land barely wide enough to bury a horse, the arithmetic was brutal, and it was simple. The state demanded its share in grain, in silk, or in copper. A dry summer meant empty granaries. A cold snap meant dead silkworms curled inside rotting cocoons. The debt did not care. The debt remained, and the punishment for falling behind was not a fine. It was not a lashing. It was slavery for the entire family line. Every son, every grandson, every daughter marked as property of the empire forever. A father staring at that future had one last asset on his land. He had boys. The wagons came in the gray hour before sunrise. They carried no flags, no imperial seals on the canvas, no drums. These belonged to the court purveyors, men whose job was to travel the back roads of the empire with heavy wooden chests bound in black iron. Locals whispered the name for them in the fields. Flesh merchants. Nobody said it out loud. A scout did not examine a child the way a village elder might. He did not ask about character. He did not ask about intelligence. He examined the boy the way a gem cutter examines a rough stone held up to morning light, hunting for the hidden fractures. The father shoved his 7-year-old into the cold. The boy's bare feet stuck to the frost. The scout lowered himself to one knee. He did not ask the child's name. Names did not matter where this boy was going. His calloused thumbs moved along the jawline, pressing into the bone to test the density underneath. He checked the cheekbones for symmetry. He pulled the mouth open and studied the gums for the pale tint of scurvy, then counted the teeth one by one. A crooked bite meant the deal was over before it began. His fingers slid down the boy's throat and pressed against the voice box, feeling for the chords, calculating how that voice might fracture when puberty arrived 5 winters from now. He measured the width of the shoulders. He gripped the thigh to gauge the length of the bone. The court had a specification sheet. The product needed to be slim, balanced, and biologically capable of holding that shape for 20 years. The entire transaction took less than 2 minutes. The scout gave a single nod. A scribe stepped forward and dropped 50 copper coins into the father's palm. The father never looked at his son again. He looked at the coins. The boy climbed into the back of a wagon where 20 other children were already sitting in total silence. The wheels began to turn. In that moment, the boy stopped existing. What stepped out of that village was no longer a son. It was inventory. The wagons rolled for weeks toward Chang'an, the glittering capital of the empire. The boys sat pressed shoulder to shoulder in the darkness under the canvas. They received water in measured cups, exactly enough to keep the kidneys functioning. They received millet gruel in tiny wooden bowls, exactly enough to prevent their organs from shutting down. The scouts had learned a long time ago that weakness was their best lock. A starving boy does not plan an escape. A starving boy does not even remember the road behind him. By the time the massive walls of Chang'an rose against the horizon like a second mountain range, most of the boys could no longer picture the layout of their own villages. Home had been erased by hunger. They did not enter through the grand gates of the Imperial palace. Raw material did not deserve ceremony. The wagons turned down a narrow service road and delivered them to a complex of low brick buildings tucked against the bureaucratic quarter. No windows, no courtyards open to the sky, just thick walls, iron doors, and locks that only opened from the outside. This was the factory floor. This was where a boy was unmade. The transformation started inside the first hour. Guards stripped them of the coarse wool and hemp they had worn from their villages. They threw every garment into stone fire pits already burning in the courtyard. The smoke carried the last trace of home into the sky. Barbers moved down the line with iron shears and shaved every scalp raw. The reasoning was cold and practical. Shaved heads killed the lice that traveled with every shipment. Shaved heads also killed identity. A bald boy wearing nothing looks exactly like the bald boy beside him. The eye cannot tell them apart. Neither can memory. The instructors walked the line with bamboo ledger boards resting against their forearms. They assigned numbers, not names. The idea of a family name no longer applied inside these walls. The boy born as the youngest son of a wheat farmer in the north ceased to exist on paper. He became a figure in a column. He became the property of the inner court, filed between the boy in front of him and the boy behind him. The curriculum had only one real subject: the total erasure of human reflex. These boys had to learn the geometry of palace space down to the centimeter. Their eyes could never rise above the waist sash of an instructor. Their lips could not move unless a question had been asked. They could not cough. They could not sneeze. They could not let a shiver cross their shoulders even in rooms where the breath turned white in the air. And to engrave these rules into the body, the instructors used violence that was measured, surgical, and chillingly intentional. They never hit the face. A discolored cheek lowered the market price of the asset. They never hit the hands. Fingers needed to float across the strings of the guqin without hesitation. Instead, when a boy broke a rule, they made him kneel on a patch of crushed pottery shards spread across the floor. Any shift in weight, any adjustment, drove the ceramic edges into the flesh of the knees. For lesser offenses, like mispronouncing a single syllable in a poem from the Book of Songs, the punishment moved to the soles of the feet. 2 men pinned the boy on his stomach. A third stepped forward with a rattan cane. 10 strikes left the arches purple and inflated. 20 strikes opened the skin in long splits. The boy was still required to stand upright for music practice at sunrise the next day. Beauty alone was never the goal. A favorite had to function as an intellectual mirror for the emperor, a reflection cast back in educated form. The boys sat for 14-hour stretches inside rooms where the braziers were deliberately kept cold. They memorized the Book of Songs in full. They recited the Analects of Confucius until the words arrived faster than breath. They traced the exact brush strokes of court calligraphy across fresh parchment. If a boy let the brush slip from his fingers, the instructor reached for a heated iron rod and pressed it against the inside of his forearm. The burns healed in dark rings of scar tissue. The long silk sleeves hid them from every visitor for the rest of the boy's life. Food was not food. It was a chemistry experiment. Court doctors designed feeding programs engineered to delay puberty and locked the body into a slender frame that refused to grow into a man's shape. They stripped out protein almost entirely. The daily ration arrived as a pale paste made from crushed lotus root, boiled cabbage, and rice wine diluted until it barely carried color. The diet kept the skin translucent and the limbs thin. It also kept the boys trembling at the edge of starvation every hour of every day. And that hunger was the quiet hand on the leash. A boy who is dreaming of a single spoon of rice is not dreaming of freedom. The cosmetic regimen crossed the line into slow poisoning. The court demanded skin that looked like polished porcelain under lamplight. The boys were required to coat their faces every morning with thick layers of powder ground from lead and rice flour. The lead soaked through the pores. The lead entered the blood. After years of daily application, the metal settled into the nervous system and began dismantling it from the inside. The boys suffered from crushing headaches that lasted days. Their hands trembled without warning. Some went blind in sudden episodes that lasted hours and then passed. The court did not care. An emperor wanted a flawless face beside him at dinner. A poisoned boy with a flawless face was worth more in that ledger than a healthy boy whose skin had ever seen the sun. The voice received its own laboratory. To guarantee soft silver tones that would not crack, the boys trained their breathing for hours. They submerged their faces in basins of icy water and held their breath until their lungs caught fire, learning to command the smallest motions of the diaphragm. They sang long notes into empty clay jars and studied the resonance. A single crack in the voice at the wrong moment could end a career overnight. And in the inner court, the end of a career was rarely a peaceful retirement. The factory accepted loss as part of the design. Administrators openly projected a 40% defect rate. The body refuses perfection, and the body won more battles than the court wanted to admit. Dysentery spread through the holding rooms when the water cisterns turned stagnant in summer. Infections crept up from the split skin on their feet and settled into the bloodstream. Some boys simply starved at the desk during calligraphy practice, slumping forward onto the wet ink and never waking up. Suicide claimed everyone else. The isolation, the violence, the silence, all of it drove the boys into a quiet, dark place no instructor could reach. A boy would wait until the guards changed shifts at the third watch. He would uncoil the hemp cord from the sash at his waist, loop it over a wooden rafter, and close out his own production cycle before sunrise. The instructors showed no grief. They cut the rope. They dragged the body through the back door. They threw it into a lime pit dug behind the compound where the earth dissolved bone within weeks. Then they erased the number from the bamboo ledger. Defective product. The state wrote off the cost and moved on. Before we go further into the machinery that waited behind those palace walls, I need to stop for a moment. You are watching this because you already know something. You already understand that real history does not live in textbooks. It lives in the shadows, in the forgotten ledgers, in the pages scribes were told to burn. I want to invite you into our inner circle. Become a member of the lineage. This is not about clicking a button to support a channel. This is about taking your seat inside a community that demands the truth, no matter how ugly it looks under the light. By joining the lineage, you keep this investigation breathing. You fund the research. You guarantee that stories buried for 2,000 years get pulled back into the open air. You also receive early access to our full documentaries and a direct line to the team behind every episode. If you belong with us, join right now. The button is waiting below. The boys who survived the full 5-year gauntlet reached their so-called graduation. Their skin was pale as carved bone. Their calligraphy moved like running water. Their voices had been tuned to sound like soft bronze bells. They could recite 1,000 classical poems without missing a syllable. They could cross a marble floor without producing a single sound. And somewhere along the way, every single one of them had forgotten what their mothers looked like. The court tailors entered the compound. They wrapped each survivor in layer after layer of embroidered silk, so heavy the boys had to relearn how to walk. They clipped carved jade ornaments to their belts. They painted their mouths with red cinnabar pulled from sealed porcelain jars. The factory had completed its run. The product was ready to enter the market. The boys stepped out of those windowless brick halls and walked for the first time into the gold-soaked maze of the inner palace. They believed they had already lived through the worst the Empire could show them. They were wrong. The factory had only been the preparation. The real danger had not even opened its eyes yet. It was sitting inside the golden cage, waiting for them to walk in. The heavy wooden doors of the inner palace swung shut, with a sound closer to a trunk splitting open in a forest than a door closing. The iron bolts slid home with a long, deliberate grind. The boys stood frozen in the center of a massive courtyard paved with white marble so polished it reflected the sky. The air carried 3 scents braided together: crushed orchids, burning sandalwood, and underneath them both, the faint sweet rot of still water trapped in ornamental pools. Eunuchs wrapped in patterned silk surrounded the new arrivals. They held tall lanterns that threw long, jagged shadows across the stone, like dark fingers reaching for the boys' feet. These graduates of the brick factory believed they had finally reached shelter. They were catastrophically wrong. What they had done was trade a windowless slaughterhouse for a cage made of gold. The architecture of the Imperial harem was not designed for living. It was designed as a weapon, a slow-motion instrument of psychological disorientation. The corridors bent and curved, and then bent again in identical loops, until memory itself gave up trying to map them. Red lacquered pillars stood every few paces, all cut to the same height, all carved with the same patterns. Every window was filtered through wooden screens so thick the sunlight arrived diced into meaningless squares. A boy could spend 20 years inside the inner court and never once see a real horizon. The state assigned each new arrival a single windowless chamber buried in the maze. Inside that room sat a heated brick bed, a small bronze mirror, and a single silk pillow stuffed with herbs. There were no locks on the inside of any door. The eunuchs held the keys to the rooms. The eunuchs held the keys to the kitchens. The eunuchs held the keys to the air itself, because in this place survival was granted and revoked by the men with the key rings hanging from their sashes. Staying alive inside the harem had nothing to do with strength. Muscle was useless here. Survival was a war fought entirely inside the mind. The court housed hundreds of boys at any given time, sometimes more than 1,000. But the emperor had only one evening, only one bed, only one pair of eyes. Attention was the only currency that existed in this economy. The absence of attention was a slow starvation, and the boys figured out within their first week that the greatest threat to their future was not the emperor looming at the top of the pyramid. The real threat was the boy sleeping in the room next door. The boy with the same training. The boy with the same calculations running behind his painted face. The sabotage was quiet, it was constant, and it was creative. A rising favorite would wake up before a command performance and discover the strings of his guqin had been sliced through with a razor blade in the hours before dawn. A boy celebrated for his porcelain skin might pick up his lacquer jar of face powder one morning and find it had been seeded overnight with crushed glass ground fine as flour. He would apply it. Within seconds, the glass would open thin red lines across his cheeks and temples. His career ended before sunrise. The eunuchs would drag him down the corridor by his ankles. The boys who remained did not look up. They did not flinch. They stepped over the blood trail on the way to morning practice, and they smiled at each other over their tea. Food was not nourishment in this world. Food was the primary delivery system for murder. The Imperial kitchens produced banquet-grade meals daily. Roasted pheasant glazed with honey. Lotus seed broth simmered for hours. Steamed carp arranged on porcelain plates with carved radishes shaped like flowers. A boy who had fallen out of favor received cold congealed rice and a bowl of lukewarm water. A boy climbing the ladder received delicacies. He also received poison, slipped in at the end of the ladle by a kitchen hand who had been paid a month's wages in hidden gold. The preferred weapon was an extract pulled from the oleander plant. Oleander does not kill immediately. That is the entire point. It makes the heart race and skip in unpredictable bursts. It floods the lungs with the sensation of drowning on dry land. The victim collapses mid-performance, soaked in sweat, shaking, unable to hold a single note. The emperor looks up from his wine and sees a broken, sickly creature twitching on the floor. The emperor looks away, and the boy who ordered the poison steps quietly into the empty space at the emperor's side. The pressure of maintaining the illusion of flawless divinity around the clock began to shatter their minds. They performed without pause. There was no offstage. If the emperor wanted a song at 3 in the morning, the boy had to rise from sleep and produce a voice like polished silver, showing no trace of exhaustion. If the emperor wanted a warm body pressed against him, the boy had to respond with perfect eagerness. They smiled until the muscles in their faces cramped into hard knots. They walked with the measured gliding steps they had been trained in until the arches of their feet split open inside their embroidered slippers. To endure the unbearable weight of non-stop performance, they turned to chemistry. The court physicians, fully aware of what they were doing, supplied them with a compound known throughout the dynasty as 5-mineral powder. The recipe was not a secret. Crushed stalactites scraped from cave ceilings, yellow sulfur, powdered quartz, amethyst ground to dust, and red clay bound it together. The boys dissolved the mixture in warm rice wine and drank it alone in their rooms behind closed doors. The chemical reaction inside the body was savage. The heavy metals and sulfur ignited a slow, violent heat that spread from the core outward. Their skin flushed bright crimson in patches. They tore off their silk robes and walked barefoot across the frozen courtyard stones in the dead of winter just to keep their blood from cooking inside their veins. The powder also dragged the mind into territory the body could not follow. It induced hallucinations so vivid the boys described shapes moving inside the walls. It numbed the nervous system until fear became a distant sound. A boy, floating on 5-mineral powder, could sit perfectly still while a rival dismantled his reputation 3 rooms away. He could laugh gently while the Emperor ran fingers across his face. He felt nothing. That was the point. The price of that numbness was physical collapse on a cellular level. The powder stripped the enamel from their teeth until the surfaces turned soft and yellow. It opened deep weeping sores across their backs and the insides of their thighs. They packed the sores with cotton and hid them beneath extra layers of heavy silk. They coated their rotting teeth with white mineral paint. They became walking corpses held together by chemistry and fear, smiling at banquets while their bodies disintegrated underneath the silk. But the real executioner in the harem was not poison, not jealousy, not the powder. It was time. The court worshipped youth the way other cultures worshipped gods. At 18, a boy was treated as an earthly deity. He could demand a carved jade statue of himself, and it would arrive by the end of the week. He could request a country estate, and the scribes would draw up the deed before dinner. At 24, something shifted. A microscopic line appeared at the corner of one eye. The jawline widened by a fraction of an inch nobody could measure, but everybody could see. The Emperor noticed without ever naming what he had noticed. The invitations to the private chambers grew sparse. Then, they stopped. The fall was brutal and fast. The eunuchs moved the aging boys out of the inner rings of the palace and into the outer buildings where the wind came through the walls in winter. The rooms grew cold. The food grew thin. They had entered what the palace called the ghost phase. They drifted through the damp stone corridors in frayed robes, coughing into their sleeves, haunting the edges of a court that had already forgotten their names. Most did not wait for the cold to finish them. They found a high wooden rafter in an unused hall. They used the embroidered sashes that had once marked their rank. The cycle turned. New boys arrived in wagons at dawn. Sometimes, though, the system broke. Sometimes an emperor's obsession with a single favorite burst through the careful architecture of the court and infected the state itself. That is where we come back to Emperor Ai in the year 4 BC. Dong Xian was nobody when the story started. He was a minor attendant, standing quietly near a doorway, holding a basin of warm water for someone else. The emperor happened to walk past. The emperor stopped. The emperor looked at the boy's face. The empire cracked down the middle in that single second. Emperor Ai did not simply take Dong Xian into his bed. He took him into the throne room. He tipped the contents of the national treasury into the boy's lap and then kept pouring. He commissioned a second palace for Dong Xian designed as a mirror image of the imperial residence. He ordered the state architects to carve out a tomb for Dong Xian directly beside his own mausoleum, so they could be buried side by side like married rulers. He threw titles at Dong Xian's family the way a butcher tosses scraps to starving dogs at the back door. Dongxian's father was elevated to marquis. His sister was installed as a prime consort inside the harem. A boy raised in a provincial backwater now directed the movement of wealth across the largest civilization on Earth. Then, the emperor turned to the military. He summoned the Grand Council. He summoned men who had spent 4 decades riding the frozen northern steppes, fighting the Xiongnu nomads. Men missing fingers. Men with faces cut apart by Xiongnu arrows and rebuilt with scar tissue. He made these veterans kneel on the cold marble floor of the throne room with their foreheads pressed low. Emperor Ai lifted the heavy bronze seal of the Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces, the seal that every general in the empire had spent his life trying to deserve. The emperor walked past every one of them. He placed the seal into the hands of a 22-year-old boy wearing cinnabar on his lips and lead powder on his cheeks. Dongxian could not lift a proper sword. He had never seen a battlefield. He had never smelled blood on a frozen field. And now he commanded every soldier, every horse, every arrow, every walled garrison in the Han dynasty. The generals bowed their heads all the way to the ground. They bit the insides of their own cheeks until their mouths filled with blood. They surrendered to the boy out loud, and in silence, every one of them memorized his face. They began to count. The corruption of power through obsession reached its absolute peak 1,500 years later, during the Ming dynasty. In AD 1507, Emperor Zhengde looked at the suffocating ritual of the Forbidden City and decided he wanted none of it. He did not want to rule. He wanted to feed. He ordered his eunuchs to construct a private compound just outside the main palace walls. He named it the Bao Fang, the Leopard Quarter. This was not a government office. It was a hallucination given walls. Zhengde filled the courtyards with iron cages holding tigers, leopards, and elephants shipped north from the jungles at ruinous expense. He filled the halls with Tibetan monks chanting sutras in low voices, Portuguese mercenaries carrying the first primitive firearms ever seen inside China, and hundreds of young boys taken from the provinces in the same wagons the Han had used a millennium earlier. The Leopard Quarter was a permanent circus. Zhengde hated formal court robes. He made his favorites dress in military armor, foreign coats, barbarian costumes. They staged mock battles in the courtyards, cracking blunt practice swords against each other while the caged leopards roared a few steps away. The air held the combined scent of roasting meat, animal waste, and cheap rice wine being spilled onto the stones. Zhengde would disappear into this compound for months. The empire ground to a halt. Bureaucrats stood outside the locked gates holding desperate scrolls about famines sweeping the south and nomadic invasions eating into the northern border. The emperor ignored every one of them. He was inside, drinking heavily with teenage boys, while the state he was supposed to run began to rot. Inside the Leopard Quarter, a boy's survival depended on one specific skill: the ability to match the emperor's manic energy minute by minute. If Zhengde wanted to hunt, the boys mounted horses and galloped through the private parks, pretending to be Mongol raiders. If a boy was thrown from the saddle and broke his arm on the gravel, the eunuchs dragged him out and replaced him before the dust settled. They lived inside a constant flood of adrenaline and fear. They were living toys inside a zoo operated by a man whose mind had slipped off its hinges. We are about to see this entire structure collapse. But before we watch the Empire strike back, I want you to look at the screen. You see the View Products button sitting just below this video. The primary source archive for this script, the foundation underneath every horror we have uncovered, is sitting on that shelf right now. It is a monolithic collection of records most people never get to read. Economic ledgers from the imperial cages, architectural blueprints of the harem complex, the numbers behind the boys. You need this archive in your hands to truly understand the scale of what was done. Alongside it, we have placed a curated selection of obscure historical artifacts. I am not going to tell you exactly what they are. I want you to open that shelf and see for yourself. Go claim your piece of the archive while I take you to the end of this story. The fundamental flaw built into every favorite's existence was hidden inside the source of his power. He owned the wealth of a civilization. He commanded the armies. He carried the jade seals of state. But every coin, every title, every breath he drew was tied by invisible thread to a single biological event. The beating of one specific heart, the emperor's. Xian lay in the dense darkness of his private estate. He possessed a personal fortune larger than the state treasury of most neighboring kingdoms. He controlled the military. He was 22 years old. And then a messenger arrived at his gate in the middle of the night. The boy at the door carried no gift. He carried a report from the imperial physicians. Emperor Ai had collapsed inside his private chambers. His chest was rattling with fluid. He was coughing thick blood onto the white silk of his sheets. The emperor's heart was giving out. Xian stood very still. The cold truth arrived all at once, like a stone dropped through a frozen lake. He did not rule the empire. He never had. He was a parasite, attached to a dying host. And out there, beyond the gates of his mirror palace, the men with the missing fingers and the scarred faces were already pulling their swords from the scabbards. They had been waiting for this night. They were counting the emperor's breaths. Emperor Ai released his last breath on a humid summer night in the year 1st BC. He was 25 years old. The imperial physicians took one look at the body and stepped back from the silk bed without speaking. They did not reach for any instruments. They did not attempt to revive him. They dropped straight to their knees and pressed their foreheads against the lacquered floorboards. The single heartbeat that had been powering the machinery of the entire empire had just gone silent. And inside a private estate on the other side of the palace complex, Xian was about to learn that the quiet hanging over the city was the sound of his own death being prepared. The news of the emperor's death did not spill into the streets of Chang'an. The information traveled inward, threading its way through the corridors to the sealed chambers of the Empress Dowager Wang Zhengjun. She was not a grieving relative. She was a political survivor who had outlasted 3 emperors and multiple palace purges by building a heart out of polished ice. She did not pause to mourn the young man who had just died in her family tree. She moved for the imperial seals the moment the news arrived. Before the first light cracked the eastern sky, she had already summoned her nephew. Wang Mang, a man who understood exactly how naked power operated when the ceremony was stripped away. He also happened to despise the painted 22-year-old who currently held the highest military command in the empire. He gathered a column of fully armed guards and walked straight into the inner courtyard of Xian's estate. Xian was standing in the great hall of his mirror palace when they kicked in the doors. He was still wrapped in the heavy layered robes of the supreme commander of the armed forces. He was still holding the heavy bronze seal of the military in his soft hands. He had no idea how to use any of it. When Wang Mang stepped across the threshold and demanded the seal, Xian did not call for his generals. He did not order the personal guard to draw weapons. He did not even raise his voice. He simply extended the bronze square and placed it into the older man's palm. And then he began to cry. It was the terminal collapse of a boy raised inside a golden cage. He had been trained in the precise angle of pouring warm wine. He had been trained in the memorization of classical verse. He had never once been trained in how to fight for his own life. The guards walked him back to his estate and bolted the gates from the outside. He sat down in the main hall beside his wife. They both understood how the court handled its leftovers. There was no such thing as exile. There was no quiet retirement in a distant province. The machine never left loose threads. Before the sun dropped again, they swallowed a vial of concentrated poison together. The suicide should have ended the revenge. It didn't. Wang Mang was not satisfied with 2 dead bodies. He wanted to erase Dong Xian from existence. When the boy's father tried to bury his son in a jade burial suit, a sacred privilege carved out only for royal blood, Wang Mang gave the order personally. Soldiers marched to the newly sealed crypt. They shattered the heavy stone doors with iron hammers. They dragged the rotting corpse out into the afternoon light of the courtyard. They pried the jade tiles off the flesh plate by plate until the body lay naked on the stone. Then they hauled what was left into a shallow, unmarked pit that the state used for executed criminals, and they threw it in. The state auditors arrived next. They moved with terrifying precision. They confiscated 4 billion copper coins. They seized the silk reserves, the imported Fergana horses, the scattered tracts of farmland, the storehouses of jade. They stripped Dong Xian's father of his marquis title. They loaded the entire bloodline into prison carts and sent them south into the malarial swamps of the southern frontier, where fever took a man inside 3 years. Dong Xian had gone from ruling the planet to rotting in a nameless ditch in under 48 hours. This kind of total annihilation was not a tragic exception. It was the standard protocol. The Imperial machine ate its favorites on a rotation, and the process almost never varied. Rewind 150 years earlier to the reign of Emperor Wen around 163 BC, and you find the same story with different names. Emperor Wen had fallen hard for a low-born boatman named Deng Tong, a man pulled from the Yellow River and dropped into the inner court. The obsession carried the same gravity that would later destroy Emperor Ai. One afternoon, a court physiognomist was summoned to examine Deng Tong's face. He traced the fine lines curving around the boatman's mouth with his finger. Then he delivered a prophecy in a quiet voice. He said this man would eventually die of starvation. Emperor Wen laughed out loud when he heard it. He decided he would rewrite fate using nothing but the financial firepower of the empire. The emperor granted Deng Tong a literal mountain in the Yandao region. The mountain was not a symbol. It was loaded with raw copper veins running deep into the rock. Then the emperor granted the boatman the legal right to strike his own coinage. Deng Tong coins began flooding the empire within months. They traded in the loud markets of Chang'an. They traded in the frozen Silk Road outposts near the northern frontier. They traded in the fishing villages of the south. The boatman's personal wealth grew larger than the state treasury. He had been handed the closest thing a human being could ever hold to infinite capital. And yet he carried the exact same flaw stitched into every favorite in Chinese history. His entire existence was tethered to the breathing of one aging man. Emperor Wen died in 157 BC. His successor, Emperor Jing, climbed onto the throne with a deep, quiet hatred for the boatman already fully formed in his chest. Jing did not order an execution. Execution was too fast. Execution was too merciful. He had a better idea. He wanted to make the prophecy come true. He wanted to watch it happen. Emperor Jing revoked the minting rights on the very first morning of his reign. He sent thousands of soldiers to occupy the Copper Mountain. He confiscated every estate, every horse, every servant, every embroidered cushion Deng Tong had ever owned. Then he placed the boatmen under house arrest inside a single empty room. The guards at the door received one specific instruction. They were forbidden to give him food. They were forbidden to allow anyone else to give him food. The human body collapses in precise stages when starvation sets in. First, the fat reserves burn away. The face hollows out. The ribs begin to press against the skin. Then the body moves on to the muscle tissue, consuming itself from the inside. The organs shrink. The joints begin to ache as the cartilage thins, and the bones grind against each other. Deng Tong sat in the empty room, shivering. The man whose face had been printed onto coins circulating across 3,000 miles slowly wasted away. He died of starvation with worthless copper coins scattered across the floor around his body. The machine reset. The books were cleared. The court waited for the next boy. Dynasties cracked. Capitals burned down and rose again from the ashes under new names. The Mongols came roaring down from the northern steppes, ruled for a century, and were eventually pushed back out. The Ming dynasty erected the Forbidden City, locking the imperial cage behind towering red walls that still stand. The Qing dynasty came after them and expanded everything. The aesthetics of the court shifted. The robes changed. The hairstyles changed. The official language changed. But the meat grinder inside the palace ran the same program century after century. The state kept harvesting boys. The scouts kept combing the starving provinces with their iron-banded chests full of copper coins. The 40% mortality rate in the training compounds held steady for 2,000 years. Generations of children had their identities stripped away. Their faces were painted with toxic lead. Their bodies were chemically dismantled by 5-mineral powder. They lived short, brilliant lives in the shadows of thrones they could never actually sit on, and they fought silent, vicious wars over a single glance from a man who regarded them as livestock. The final collapse of the system did not come wrapped in any dignity. It came crushed underneath the weight of modern history. In AD 1912, the Qing dynasty fell. The Republic of China formed outside the palace walls, but the young Emperor Puyi remained locked inside the inner court, a hollow figurehead ruling over a dead structure. The eunuchs and the last generation of palace boys drifted through the decaying halls like shadows that had forgotten why they were there. The state stipends that had funded the court for centuries stopped arriving. Within a year, the remaining court attendants were quietly stealing imperial relics, jade carvings, ancient scrolls, polished gold ceremonial bowls, and smuggling them out through the service gates to sell to foreign antique dealers in Tianjin just to buy bowls of plain rice. In AD 1924, the warlord Feng Yuxiang surrounded the Forbidden City with modern artillery. He gave the court a few hours to vacate the grounds. The heavy wooden doors opened for the very last time in their original function. The surviving inhabitants were pushed out into the freezing streets of Beijing. They carried no identification. They held no family names that meant anything anymore. They possessed a set of skills that had no market value whatsoever in the industrial century they had just been thrown into. They knew how to cross a marble floor without producing a single footstep. They could recite classical poetry from memory while kneeling for hours. They could mix face powder that made the skin look like porcelain. They froze that winter in the narrow alleys behind the new factories, crouched over small fires, eating whatever scraps they could find. The final erasure arrived in AD 1949. The communist forces swept across the mainland and everything shifted again. The new regime looked at the last surviving remnants of the imperial court and did not see victims of a brutal 2,000-year system. They saw symptoms of a rotten feudal disease that needed to be removed. There was no rehabilitation offered. There was no apology. There was no record correction. The state security forces began hunting down the remaining former court attendants one by one. They pulled them from rented rooms in the middle of the night. They loaded them onto trains. They sent them to forced labor camps in the frozen north, out past the Great Wall, in regions where winter temperatures killed people who had been healthy their entire lives. Men who had been trained from the age of 7 to keep their hands pale and soft were handed rusted iron pickaxes. They were ordered to break frozen earth for 14 hours a day. Their joints gave out first. Then the lungs. They died from exposure. They died from untreated pneumonia. They died anonymous deaths in anonymous pits. Then the state turned to the archives. They entered the vast Imperial record halls, and they gathered the bamboo ledgers from the training compounds. They gathered the purchase receipts filed by the scouts. They gathered the medical logs from the eunuchs. They gathered the inventory lists that had counted human beings like stacks of grain. They dragged everything into the courtyards, and they built enormous pyres. They set the paperwork on fire. The smoke carried 20 centuries of names into the Beijing sky and scattered them into the wind. That was the final victory of the machine. It did not simply devour their bodies in their lifetimes. It reached forward through history and devoured their memories too. We walk through the pristine museums today and stare at the jade burial suits of the emperors through thick panes of glass. We photograph the intricate silk tapestries. We admire the polished bronze swords resting on velvet mounts. We read the small plaques describing the military conquests and the economic reforms. But the thousands of boys who financed every inch of that luxury with their minds and their blood and their lives are not there. They are not in the textbooks. They are not carved into the ancestral shrines. They have no graves anyone can visit. They were purchased for strings of copper coins. They were polished into perfection. And the instant their usefulness expired, they were dropped into the dark, and the dark closed over them. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. The algorithm actively buries stories like this one because they make the casual viewer uncomfortable. The only way this kind of history survives into the next decade is if you fight for it right now. Beat the algorithm. Take 1 second to subscribe to this channel. Drop a like on this video to push it up the ranks, and share it with one person in your life who deserves to see the real, unsterilized version of the past we all inherited. You have just watched another full-length premium documentary by Ancestral, your ultimate history hub on YouTube. Look at your screen right now. Another video is waiting for you. Click it and continue your walk through the dark.